A reminder, this is the second of what will be 12 code connection sessions here with our consultants from CZB, as well as our planners here at the City of Greenville. Chris, wave and say hello since we can see you on camera this time. And Shannon, our assistant city manager, who is integral in all of this planning as well. Just a quick reminder that we're calling this kind of GVL 2040 in action. That last year City Council adopted the GVL 2040 plan, set some priorities, but as Thomas reminded us last time, those priorities are not a binding document. So what we're here to do today is talk about the binding document and how you folks are helping us get to that point over the next few months. So Thomas, I will let you take it away and talk about how we're going to address the priorities we set and make them a reality.
Thanks, Beth. So yeah, today what we're hoping to do is kind of build upon the webinar that we conducted last month, and where we've kind of walked through what comprehensive planning was and what a zoning code is. Our hope today is to get into a little bit more detail about how the new development code will address the comprehensive plan's priorities. Go to the next slide. Kind of as a recap, I'll reintroduce our team. Certainly the City of Greenville, joined by Charles Buki from CZB, Matt Ingalls from Ingalls Planning and Design. We have Christy Dotson and Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio, Larry Weston from Weston Consulting, and the MRP group is our engineering team that is helping us with some of the engineering and design specifications manual that is a part of the code. So you could go to the next slide if you want.
And Thomas, can I interrupt really quick and remind anybody who might be unmuted to go ahead and mute. It seems like we're getting a little bit of background noise and I'm trying to figure out where that's coming from. So just in case we have anybody who is unmuted, go ahead and do that now so we can get the best possible audio. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. So this is a project schedule for 2022 as we work through the new development code. As you can see, we're in early February, and we're currently working through some of the code development framework, kind of the framework, the structural portion of the code, so that as we move into the middle part and the end of the year, we'll build upon that and infill with the area and bulk standards, et cetera, for the zoning code. We'll also be starting the area development plans. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but those are kind of those are nodes that could be future development areas, kind of centers, neighborhood centers, that we're going to do a little bit more in-depth study on to help set the code standards and service representations for different areas throughout the community. And then we'll get into some of the very specifics. I won't walk through all of those, but some of the specifics of the actual code writing we'll start to get into in March, April, May, and carry it out into the end of the year, when we'll take it for adoption before Planning Commission for recommendation and Council for adoption. Next slide. So this presentation is, again, about how the development code will meet the intent of the comprehensive plan. You can go to the next slide. This is a slide that we illustrated on the last webinar. And again, we just want people to make sure there is understanding that the comprehensive plan is complete, policy is set, it's a non-binding document, it gets effectuated with code, it gets effectuated with partnerships in the public, private, nonprofit sector, the residents speaking out as we move forward with a comprehensive plan with the ideals and the goals of the comprehensive plan. But to the issue at hand tonight, one of the most important components or tools to implement a comprehensive plan is the zoning code. And so that's what we'll be doing tonight. That is a binding document. So where the comp plan flies at about 35,000 feet, zoning code hits the ground. You can go to the next slide. This is a listing of the 3 primary priorities, goals for the comprehensive plan, as a continuation of the discussion last month. 3 priorities emerged with the comprehensive plan. One was to protect open space in the environment, as well as ensure that of the 2,000 plus acres that are unbuilt in the community, that we can preserve 35% of those acres moving forward. The other was affordable housing, ensuring that about 10% plus of new units built are affordable. And then the third one was to improve transportation and address corridor improvements that would be necessary as we move forward. You can go to the next slide. It's worth noting that as we worked through the comprehensive plan, there was a recognition that based on scenario planning, that we could be looking to add as much as 15 to 20,000 new people to the community. And so keeping that in mind, the need to kind of direct that development into nodes will be important. That's especially important if we want to preserve open space. It's also important if we want to define locations where we are comfortable with density. And so nodes are kind of these district or neighborhood centers, allow for mixed use kinds of development. They allow for a variation in heights that are greater than what we see on the ground today. You know, we kind of think of those as mini downtowns almost, kind of these centers that are available, accessible to the neighborhoods around them, but they do not infringe upon those neighborhoods. And so again, they tend to be intersection, small districts. Also corridors, major corridors where we have primarily big box development and parking lots. Those offer a significant opportunity for new development and potentially mixed use development as well. Next slide. This is an example out of the comprehensive plan, kind of a simple graphic to illustrate what a node could look like. Again, as you see here, they'll look different than many of the nodes we see now that might have large setbacks and parking lots out front. A new node would be a little bit tighter. It'd be a little bit more like the feeling you might get on Main Street or some of the other walkable corridors in and around the downtown. These would be mixed use and offer a variety of commercial uses, office uses, residential uses. And again, it's worth noting that if we allow additional heights, we could allow bonus densities for affordable housing in some of the upper levels. Next slide. This is a map of the nodes, or again, or you could think of these as centers, business centers, district centers. Node does sound a little bit wonky at times, but that is a good term for them. But you could see that there's about 10 of them. They're scattered throughout the community. They're some, such as, say, a McAllister Square or a Hayward Mall, that are nodes that offer redevelopment, revitalization opportunities. How do we start rethinking what those parking lots are, what those parking lots could be? Can we start to infill density, infill buildings there? Others are a little bit more wide open. There's the one on the southernmost end, Augusta, Potomac area. There's some redevelopment opportunity there, but there's also vast amounts of just underutilized or unused land down there. How do we start to envision populating, building, developing that land? Again, looking at increased densities to accommodate much of the growth that's anticipated over the next 10 to 20 years. Next slide. As we move forward, I noted that later this month, we'll be back in town and we'll be meeting with 5 advisory committees in these areas: the Stone and Stone Avenue, North Main area, Rutherford Buncombe, the North Lawrence Road Corridor, McAllister Square, the Greater Sullivan neighborhood, and South Augusta City's Edge. Again, that's that area down near Malden, Potomac, and South Augusta. So we'll be meeting with advisory panels to get their input regarding what they think these areas should be, how they should evolve over the course of the next 20 years, how they should absorb growth in an effort to protect neighborhoods and other areas. What will they look like? And we'll be conducting meetings with those folks and working with them over the course of the next 4 or so months, trying to finish up the area development plans in May or June. Those plans are intended to be representative. For example, Greater Sullivan neighborhood might provide us a lot of insights for some of the other neighborhood challenges throughout the community. North Lawrence corridor. That'll provide input on how we may address Pleasantburg Drive and other corridors throughout the community. So these were selected and intended to be representative to help frame the direction of the new code. Next slide. This is just an example of Lawrence Road. It's an example showing the far left is the current situation. As you can see, it's primarily big box development with large parking lots fronting Lawrence Road corridor. It's primarily focused on vehicular and auto-dependent demand. If you move into the middle image, you can start to see what if we did start to fill in the pad sites, those sites up front that are closer to the actual Lawrence Road right-of-way? What does that start to look like? How do we start to address some of the commercial needs and even potentially upper story residential needs? And then as you move into the image labeled 2040 on the far right side, you can see pretty much wholesale redevelopment. Big box stores would be likely eliminated. They're probably past their 15, 20-year lifespan, and you'll start to see opportunities for residential development, open space development, because we have looked at additional densities. So it's just a quick graphic to show what that transition could be like. And it's also worth noting that when you start nodal or district center development, it's not something that happens over 2, 3, or 4 or 5 years. This does take a decade or two to actually materialize. It's a significant amount of development. Next slide. This is the open space goal from the comprehensive plan, preserve 35% of the land remaining. Again, it's worth noting that as demand, as population continues to increase in the community, land supply will continue to go down and down. Hopefully, we're able to preserve land, which is also a pretty significant challenge. We're trying to preserve this 35% of land as population and demand increase. So it becomes ever more important to direct that demand to nodes and look at using vertical stories, vertical feet to accommodate some of that development. It will continue to get more and more expensive to buy land as we move forward, whether that's for development or open space. Both will continue to get more expensive. Next slide. The affordable housing goal priority set in the comprehensive plan, again, noted that our hope is that 10%, our goal is that 10% of all new housing units are affordable. The state of South Carolina does not have inclusionary zoning allowances, so we can't mandate inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is when a development is proposed to a community. Some communities have, say, 10 or 20% of inclusionary zoning requirements. They would mandate that 10 or 20% of that development would be dedicated for affordable housing. We don't have that allowance in the state of South Carolina, and so we would have to incentivize. And so if we're in a corridor or along a corridor or in a node, maybe the allowed height is 4 stories. Maybe we incentivize 2 or 3 more, subject to 10, 15% of those developments, of those square feet or those floors being deed restricted, being allocated for affordable housing. So there are tools to do that, but they're incentives, they're density bonuses to get there. We don't have the ability to mandate that. The next slide. This is an example of an integrated system of nodes and corridors, and what might the transportation infrastructure or component of that look like? Some of this may be early on, better bus stops, better bike facilities integrated into the development, more walkable opportunities so that people can park in one place and walk throughout the node or along the more densely developed corridor. As it moves into the future, maybe there are additional modes of transit and or start to get into some rail or trolley opportunities, but that would take a significant amount of density, and it would be at the end of build out just to justify the cost of that kind of infrastructure. But those are the 3 priorities that again emerged from the comprehensive plan. Those are what we're trying to ensure are wrapped into, kind of baked into the zoning code. Next slide. This is a zoomed in graphic of what some of that building fabric might look like in a development node. And then we've got some notes that indicate what we would be looking for, what we will be looking for in the new zoning code. We'll want to address parks and green space percentages as percentages of a node, for example. We'll be looking at materials and designs and the heights allowed, et cetera. So all of that will be incorporated in the code. As I'm finishing up this portion of the presentation, which is again tying the code to the comprehensive plan, Christy will talk a little bit more about some of the detail and how some of these desires get wrapped into the new development code. And so I'll turn it over to Christy unless anybody has questions up to this point, but I'll turn it over to her and she can walk through some of the detailed proposed tools.
Absolutely. Christy, before you start, just a reminder to folks to use the chat function for questions. We have a couple of folks who have asked things that we've been able to answer here in real time, so we'll do that as we can. Folks, the one that we've had, Thomas, maybe before Christy begins, is this idea of these 5 study areas and how they're very representative of other areas. But how do folks who maybe are outside of those study areas still get involved? Will there be opportunities for them to have some input as well? What will that look like?
So I think what we'll probably do is we'll be meeting with representatives and advisory committee from each of those specific areas. I think that others could attend if they have an inclination to attend. But I know that all of our work will be put onto the website as we walk through these this input, these meetings. Same with open houses. Same with any of the outreach that we conduct. It'll be available for people to see on the website. I guess I would also say that as we move beyond those 5 areas, we're going to be working with some other community advisory committees from the real estate community, from the neighborhood communities, and there may be some opportunities to coordinate with those organizations as well.
Yes, we want lots of voices to be heard. So thank you. And Christy, we'd love to hear more from you now.
Great. Thanks, Beth and Thomas. And Thomas really set us up well, in describing a lot of the concepts and the goals and ideas from the comprehensive plan. And for those of you that were at the webinar last time, you may have heard a similar question to this. What kinds of codes are likely to be recommended for Greenville? There was a specific question about form-based codes or, these kind of plenary terms that we talk about. So, I'm not going to be talking about it in the terms of a performance-based zoning or form-based zoning. I'm more going to be talking about the tools that we're thinking about using more from what's going to be the outcome. How is this going to impact development and growth? And so really what we're talking about are a hybrid of tools, that they aren't just tools for form. They aren't just tools for use. They aren't just tools for parking. We really want to take the best of each of these ideas and consolidate them in a way, in a code that serves the goals of GVL 2040, those goals of open space, of affordable housing and transportation. So if you'll go to the next slide for me. Thanks. The way that we like to think about these tools is essentially in 4 different buckets. So these are our 4 categories of tools that we like to talk about in a way that control development, or the way the built environment is going to grow and develop. And so the first of those buckets is form, and so those are tools that help decide what's the scale of the building. What are the setbacks going to be? What's the form and massing of the building, and what is it allowed to be? And then the second bucket of those tools is frontage. And if you'll stay on that slide, actually, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to do a quick overview of these, and then we'll kind of dive into each one and say, here are some examples of tools that control form and frontage, which is the sort of second bucket of tools. And for frontage, that really says, how does your building interface with the public realm? And so the public realm is the street. So what's the feeling of the building, and what does it look like as you walk down the sidewalk? So that's frontage. We have tools for what frontage needs to be in future development. Site is sometimes called development standards, and these are context-based rules that control things like vehicle access, parking requirements, even signs. And so these are rules that apply to every district, but each district may have a different flavor of those rules based on, if it's a residential district, we'll have a different flavor than commercial district. And so site really talks about the different elements in the site planning of development. And then of course the final bucket is use. And most fundamentally, use is what activities are allowed to take place on that parcel. So to dive into each of these a little bit more, so some tools that we are thinking about for form at its most basic level, and this is common in all zoning codes. It looks at what's the scale of the building, how wide do the lots need to be, what are the setbacks required on those lots, so how close can your building be to the lot lines. We are also thinking about rules for height, so those would potentially be defined in stories and feet. So being able to accommodate different heights sort of within the envelope. That's what that first illustration is showing. And another tool that's a little bit more nuanced that perhaps may be useful in some of your residential districts is something that we call variable massing. So you know that your building has to be within certain height requirements, within certain setbacks. And what's interesting in this tool that we've developed in a different community, there were some concerns about new development maybe feeling too big. And so we developed this tool that says, okay, your building, it has to fit within these height and massing requirements, but we can actually dictate where that massing exists on the site. So that's the second graphic, and it shows that, in the top image, the massing can really exist anywhere within that envelope, as long as you're meeting the other rules. The second one may be in a neighborhood that's okay with a little bit taller of homes. Maybe a lot of the homes are already 2.5 stories. And so any addition, would sort of step down in the back, or maybe accessory dwelling units fit within that lower envelope in the back. And then that lower image is an example of maybe a bungalow neighborhood where people are concerned about the scale of houses feeling big. And so it has rules for requiring the front portion of that to be a little bit lower in scale, and then you can have a little bit more flexibility in the back, and that's where you can go a little bit taller. And so that's an example of how form can also be context sensitive based on the needs of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. Transitions. Form is not just height and scale. It also matters where that height and scale exists in connection to adjacent properties. So as you have maybe a higher density node or corridor, it's really important to get that transition right as it transitions down into neighborhoods. And so those transitions can look like a lot of different things. It's not just one tool. Your most basic tool that we of course will have are things like the first image on the left. And that's just a simple, landscape and screening transition. That's pretty common in a lot of zoning codes. And then the second image that says shallow lot on it, that really shows how a mixed use district and a residential district, that mixed use district has to be a certain distance away from the property line. There's some landscape and screening requirements, and that height has to sort of step down and taper as it gets closer to the residential neighborhood. So we're thinking about those types of transitions. So it's not just landscaping, but it's also a massing and height transition. And then a third tool that we're also thinking about are transition districts themselves. So these are districts that may be something like townhomes or, small apartment like 4plexes or 6plexes that are sort of that middle scale between houses and larger scale mixed use developments. And so it's a district in and of itself that helps serve that transition. Next slide, please. So frontage. We're going to talk about a couple of different examples of tools that we have to control what development looks like as you're walking down the street. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the primary tools that we have is something that's called a build to zone. So I know this graphic is a little bit small, but if you'll kind of squint with me on the middle graphic, you can kind of see that there's a light blue ribbon that is running between the property line, which is the sort of white sidewalk, and the gray building footprint. And so what build to is it's a version of a setback. So in residential neighborhoods, in most cases, Yeah, thanks for that zoom in. I appreciate that. You know, you're in residential neighborhoods, you'll have rules that say your house must be 20 feet away from the street, for example. But Build 2 is something that we use in more urban areas. And so it provides not only a minimum setback, but also a maximum. And so what that does is it requires your building to be pulled up to the street. And it has that really engaging condition, you know, so you think about downtown as you walk down the street, all the buildings are quite close to the sidewalk, and it gives you that enclosed feeling of being in a more urban area. And so we have rules that actually require that. So your building has to be pulled up and engaging on the sidewalk as you walk down the street. So that's one example of a frontage tool that we use in all of our mixed-use commercial and apartment districts. Another one is if you look at the image that is on the furthest right, we have rules that say how much of your first floor has to be windows and doors. So we call that a glazing requirement. And so you think about windows and doors and how that really activates space. You can, you know, you have that sort of sense of being able to see the activity that's going on and it engages the street. So we have minimum requirements for that. We have requirements for how often you can have blank walls. It's, you know, a lot more entertaining to walk by building elements rather than just a blank wall. And then we also have requirements for the frequency of how often entrances have to be. And so all of these are just little, you know, good urban design principles that we can actually bake into the districts that help engage that transition from the public space on the sidewalk to the private building. Next slide, please. Thanks for zooming in and out on that. I appreciate it. Another important piece of frontage too is talking about pedestrian amenity space and really incentivizing not just open space. You know, often zoning codes will say you have to have 10% of your lot open space. Well, we go one step further and say that open space needs to be meaningful, usable, and contribute to that public-private realm. And so what this graphic is showing is that options for pedestrian amenity space. So there's a little plaza that's illustrated here to say that, you know, your open space needs to have this meaningful engagement. It can't just be sort of a grassy ditch in the back of the lot. It needs to be something that's more engaging and contributes to that public realm. Let's talk about site. So site is going to be context sensitive. I'll emphasize that throughout each one of these. And it really is, you know, it tends to be some of your more performance-based rules. So things like, we'll touch on parking a little bit. But an example of what some of the site requirements are that we're thinking about for these tools are things like pedestrian and amenity access. So we want to make sure that the vehicular access is appropriately scaled, that it doesn't conflict with a lot of the sidewalks and more pedestrian-oriented areas. And we want to make sure that that sidewalk to front door connection is really meaningful. So of course, what those requirements are in commercial districts will be different than residential districts, but they'll both have requirements for those things. Next slide, please. Parking. Parking is always an important discussion, and the reason that I wanted to show this particular example is because this community took a really context-sensitive approach to parking ratios. So if you're familiar with parking ratios, generally different uses will require certain amounts of parking. Well, what this community did is they said, yes, that's true, different uses require different amounts of parking, but then there's also different contexts in which those uses can take place. So for example, if your district is within parking package A, you can see that through A, there's just little dashes. So that means there are actually no parking requirements if your district is parking package A. And so that would be a district like downtown that is very walkable, very accessible to trails and transit and alternative uses. And so those parking ratios for a restaurant in downtown is going to be a different need than a restaurant that may be out on the edge of town. And so in this particular community, as you go down the line, B, C, D, and E, it gets more and more auto-dependent. So you have, you know, less connectivity to things like trails and transit. And so this is a context-sensitive approach to understanding the parking needs in different areas of the city. Next slide, please. Signs are always an important discussion. It really contributes to the character of the city. And one of the pieces that I want to touch on here is that these are really graphic. It's pretty evident what the sign requirements are, what the size needs to be, where it's allowed from a location standpoint. And again, it's quite context-based. So your high-rise signs or your monument signs, those are going to be in your more commercial areas. And then your sort of pedestrian signs that may be in a district more like Village of West Greenville. And then, of course, residential signs like realty signs. You know, so you have different sets of rules, and they're very graphically laid out. So it's fairly easy to understand which rules apply to you, depending on what district you're in or what context you're working within in the city. Next slide, please. We've already touched on transitions a little bit, but to piggyback onto that, you know, we have a set of tools of different types of buffers. So anytime that, you know, a district is adjacent to another property that may be a different use or less intense use, or even when a parking lot is next to a sidewalk, you know, we want to be able to buffer that and make sure that there isn't any impact between those two properties. And so we have different types of screening. So in this image, you know, you have type A1 is what it's labeled. And that's a little bit more suburban. It's a wider landscape buffer with some larger trees. And then the second type may be a little bit more urban of a condition. So because there's less space, there's a little wall that's included there. And so there's different types of buffers for different types of development patterns, and being able to give those different flavors for different needs and contexts. Next slide, please. And finally, we'll just touch on use briefly. If you'll go to the next slide. A big part of use is just being able to know what you can use your property for, right? And so one of the big ways that we like to simplify that is to make the tables very graphic, very readable, so that you can look across and find your district, and then just go down the line and see what uses you're allowed within that district. And then, of course, you know, in the last column, what we'll do is in the code just link that use to any additional standards that may apply. So, you know, if you're a little bit more intensive use, maybe you have some additional screening standards or, you know, things like that for things, you know, like gas stations maybe have additional screening standards. And so we try to make this quite graphic and usable so that it's accessible and easy to understand what the requirements are and what uses are even allowed in certain districts. Next slide, please. And finally, I'll just touch on, and Thomas did a really good job of talking about the different incentives. So, you know, we have the GVL 2040 goals of affordable housing, open space, and transportation. And, you know, we're not able to necessarily mandate that a lot of these goals be baked into development, but what we're thinking about are tools for how to incentivize those. So that it's and enticing as development happens, that this development helps contribute to these goals. Next slide, please. So some of the incentives that we're thinking about, and these are pretty broad, you know, we're thinking about potentially bonus height, again, in areas that make sense. So as Thomas was covering a lot of the nodes and corridors, you know, so that additional height for things like providing affordable housing, or maybe improved open space. So thinking about how some of that could be, maybe you have an environmentally sensitive area and that could become this really beautiful stormwater park. And so incentivizing that trade-off, so giving a little bit more height for that improvement. And then even incentivizing potentially things like structured parking. We know that surface parking takes up a lot of really valuable land, but structured parking is expensive. And so helping incentivize that trade-off so that we potentially could get some better uses on the really valuable land that you have in Greenville for structuring that parking as opposed to just making a sea of parking. So another good trade-off. And then finally, incentives for getting to that transportation piece. So having alternative, you know, we call it alternative compliance. So you have to provide X amount of parking on your site. Maybe it's 100 spaces. And so what we're thinking about are ways that, maybe if you improve trail connectivity on the site, or if you have improved transit facilities like better bus stops, or even more bus stops, things like better bicycle parking. So those would count towards your required parking. And so those are trade-offs if we want to incentivize these alternative modes of transit. And so that could help offset the amount of vehicular parking that you have to provide on site. So we're thinking about these trade-off and incentive tools that we can build into the zoning code. And I believe that is it. I will hand it back to Thomas and Beth and Larry. If you want to jump in, we'll go to whatever questions folks have.
Thank you, Christy. Again, reminding folks that the chat is where we would like your questions this afternoon, evening, and we'll go from there. Thomas, as we wait for folks to ask questions, kind of what are next steps for your group, and kind of where do we go here in this next month before we start to update folks again?
So our next steps will be initially jumping into the area development plans, those 5 areas. We really want to kind of get an opportunity to meet with the folks in those areas that are representing the advisory committees. And so that'll be our initial next steps. But I know that Christy and Lee, they have really started to dig into the existing land management ordinance. They've started to pull data out to create kind of a district framework to start to analyze the existing zoning districts. And so a lot of that work will be underway simultaneously. Again, the idea is to kind of overlay the area planning work with the work that is a little bit more detailed in terms of zoning. So really, a couple of weeks from now, we'll be meeting with the 5 area groups and then giving Christy and Lee the opportunity to take that information, our findings, and wrap it into the code. So those are our next steps. We had the opportunity today to meet with the community empowerment teams, some local neighborhood groups, some leaders, and that was really, really good. They gave us a tremendous amount of information and input about what they want in the neighborhoods. And so we'll just continue to try to reach out to different groups and neighborhoods and committees and start putting pen to paper.
Chris, are you able to go back? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just think it's a good place to emphasize the point that, while we're talking about tools and incentives, Christy made some very important points. She made great points that many planners would understand. For neighborhood residents and for people who aren't planners, this code is really a tool that you can use. And because it is expected to be and planned to be accessible with graphics and other kinds of tools that you can use, it should be a tool that you can use to get things done that you'd like to get done. Right now, we've got a code that is about 300 pages that is not accessible, that is confusing in many ways. We expect to have a new code that will be more user-friendly, that will be that can be seen as a useful tool that our neighborhood residents and other stakeholders can use as a way of making their impact into the system known. And I just think it's a good opportunity to make that point. I suspect that we may get some questions about that. And so rather than, I'm just trying to anticipate some of the questions that we'll have, because there were a lot of terms to try and understand in the course of the last presentation. And Christy makes it as plain and as understandable as possible. But the main thing that residents have to understand is that this whole code can be a tool that you can use. It should be accessible enough, and it should be intuitive enough so that you can understand what's going on and use it to help get the things done that you'd like to get done. That's the point I'd like to make. Done. Beth, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I always love to hear what you have to say. This is supposed to be a conversation and very organic, so it's absolutely perfect. Christy, you were talking towards the end about a lot of the tools, and I'm curious, perhaps maybe in some other communities, what tools have you guys used? What incentives you've used that have been successful in terms of, getting developers to help us meet some of these goals that we have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, really the key thing is to try to calibrate each of these tools to the specific community because, Greenville is not Charlotte, is not Atlanta, Greenville is unique. And the economics and
Thank
the
you for
land
saying
value.
so. We think so too.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what makes it so special, right? This amazing downtown and the needs of downtown are different than other parts of the city. And so that is really key to right sizing these incentives is understanding the local drivers, the local economics, where are the local activity centers, and so where is development wanting to go. And the truth is that the way that we try to write these tools into the zoning code is that so a developer understands what's expected of them. It's very clear. They understand what needs to be done. How does the building need to meet the public realm? What are their expectations? And so having that sort of baseline really sets it up for a meaningful conversation because any of these incentives that a developer provides also makes the development more enticing for folks to move in, whether it's businesses or residents or whoever. And it also makes the city a better place. So it's something that can be provided both for the city and for the developer. And so having those rules be really clear and then setting up those incentives to be a conversation that makes both the development and the city better, it really brings it to a collaborative conversation instead of a what will you give me so I can do this kind of framework.
It does kind of, yeah, it's all in how you phrase it, right? It's about wanting to work together and be collaborative rather than feeling like you're having to force somebody or but I'm not thinking the right word, like, yeah, have a stronghold on them or push them into something that they don't want to do. We've got a great question about private property and neighborhoods, and will there be anything in this code specific to neighborhoods? And if somebody say, how does this affect my house? How does this affect me? I think is the question that a lot of folks are asking.
I can take a first stab at that, but Christy will have a better and more detailed answer. But I would say, yes, the code will impact neighborhoods. It will impact people's neighborhoods and what is allowed on their lots. Currently they have a set of zoning standards that limits what they can and cannot do on their lots, right? And so the new code will also have very similar requirements. And we haven't yet started to dig into specific neighborhoods. We're hoping to jump into the greater Sullivan neighborhood work in 2 weeks. And so we'll kind of get a much better idea of what their tolerance is for change or how much they want to keep the same in terms of lot sizes, setbacks, heights, those kinds of things. But those are discussions that we will have because every property will be impacted. Residential, commercial, you name it, it's all impacted.
Christy, do you want to add to that?
I'll just follow up with a similar response, actually, that that this code is meant to be much more clear, the rules much more understandable. I think Larry made a great point about this, that it should make it much easier for people to understand what can and can't be done on their property, what is and isn't expected of them in development. And so that just fundamentally should make it a much better experience for folks trying to make improvements on their property.
And Chris, if you're able to go back as to the section where we show these kind of 5 representative areas, and you mentioned working with Greater Sullivan, and we've got folks who really are invested, and we chose these areas because they really do have similar qualities and characteristics to other major pieces of Greenville. So I like the way you made the connection between, hey, what we study on Lawrence Road will be very applicable to what we might want to do on Pleasantburg. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, if we could do a small area plan or area development studies in every neighborhood, we would love to do that, right? There's just not the time nor the resources to do it. And so when we did look at these were chosen because of their representative characteristics. But again, for example, Greater Sullivan may have some, compelling, we may get very compelling input with regard to direction, that may be similar to something up in Sterling. They're both kind of next to the city's edge, moving into the county. And so we think what we hear will be applicable and tradable, if you will, as we move down the road. Certainly, these are the first 5 areas that we're looking at. But as we work through this zoning, this development code, this zoning ordinance, as we work through this, we'll provide significant opportunities for public input. We'll conduct a significant amount of public outreach that'll be outside of these areas. These areas just kind of get that deep dive, if you will, but there will be opportunities for other areas. But even South Augusta may have some similarities to something that might happen out near Clemson ICAR area, where you've got, some developable space out there, right? It could be something north of Conisty, what might happen in that area. So we think that we'll start to be able to apply general principles. Everything will, at the end of the day, require place-specific zoning, but we think that the attributes may be pretty similar.
We've got a couple of great questions I want to get to, but I got to tell you, it brings me great peace to hear you talk, Thomas, with such a comfort level about different areas of our community, which helps us realize that even though you're consultants, you know us, you know Greenville. You're not just kind of coming in and saying, oh, we think this has worked well somewhere else. And so thank you for knowing us and taking the time to be in a relationship with us and respect us and learn about us. It just makes us feel better about the process. And so a great question from Sam here is obviously understanding that character is important, but also, density as Greenville grows, wanting to meet the goals of GVL 2040, talking about the use of the single family home zoning and, wondering if that's a contributor to part of the affordable housing issues and, is that something that will be considered in this process?
Yes, yes, and yes, absolutely. And so these are really hard questions, right? The issue of single family zoning and affordability, certainly larger lots are less affordable. And so by definition, they are less accessible to those at middle and lower income levels, right? But we also have heard through the course of the comprehensive planning process that many of the neighborhoods, they definitely want to protect their authenticity, their character, et cetera. And so this is where we'll really have to touch base with the local neighborhood leaders, the residents themselves, and ask them, what is your tolerance for change or not? Much of the kind of the focus of the comprehensive plan was to say, we have heard that many of the neighborhoods want to kind of maintain a certain characteristic that they hold right now, whether that's, single or 2-story heights, for example, right? If that is the case, and that is the direction, then we definitely have to be able to put that density in the nodes. And so it is a trade-off, right? If you don't allow for change in one area in a neighborhood or in a single family zoning area, then that trade-off is that density gets increased in the nodes very nearby, right? And so those are the discussions that we have to have. Those are really hard discussions. We suspect that it'll probably vary a bit from neighborhood to neighborhood, but those are the discussions we have to have. Really tough ones. I don't know if Larry has any input on that, but we're just starting to get that kind of input from some of the neighborhoods this week. I think you're on mute, Larry.
I think you've been pretty clear about that, Thomas. We'll continue to look for input, and as Beth mentioned, this is about developing a relationship. I mean, we've got to deepen that relationship so that we understand the differences as we move from one neighborhood to another. All neighborhoods are not alike. Inside of neighborhoods, all residents are not alike. There's a texture and a complexity there that is important to understand and to be aware of as you face some of these very difficult and very challenging questions. So our commitment is to do exactly that, and we'll continue to honor that commitment as we go forward and tackle some very difficult questions. It's not going to be easy. It is not going to be an easy trip. There will be disagreements. There will be disagreements inside neighborhoods. There will be disagreements between neighborhoods. There will be a lot of discussion at the council. There will be a lot of politics involved. But as long as we keep to our knitting, as long as we seek the truth and try and be as honest and forthright as we can, I think we'll get to the end of this in a good way.
And I'll just add briefly too that, you know, part of what's going to be so crucial with the small area plans is that testing of these tools. So, you know, we're zoning wonks, we have all these tools available, and so it's really just having that conversation and saying, you know, if neighborhood character or scale is really what folks are concerned about, then, you know, is it okay if we really control that scale, make sure it looks like a house, feels like a house, matches the street? But is it okay if it's 2 units or 3 units? It looks exactly the same as the neighbors. And, you know, those are the conversations that we want to have, because we have tools to be able to do those things. And, you know, there are ideas that we've implemented in communities across the U.S. And, you know, different communities have different tolerances for different ideas. Maybe other communities prefer, you know, if the house in the front is a house in the front, but maybe there can be 2 accessory dwelling units in the back. So the backyard isn't quite as protected, or folks aren't quite as concerned. And so we have a range of tools, but it really is having those conversations to see, you know, how folks want to tackle this challenge that we have of character and affordable housing, and where people want to see that happen in their neighborhood.
And as Larry mentioned, you know, neighbors are different. Not everybody has the same idea for what their neighborhood should be now and in the future. We've got a great question from Laura here about kind of really process. So wondering, once the code is approved, what about these developments that are kind of in progress or ongoing? Will people be grandfathered in, or kind of when will this start, if you will?
Typically, projects that have already been approved, they're grandfathered. They're vested under the current code. So if there's a project that is underway, it'll be vested under the current code. If there are projects that might be much larger projects, and maybe a phase is approved, subsequent phases would likely fall under the new code. And so that vesting wouldn't take place. But if a project's underway or under construction, or it's received an approval from the Planning Commission, for example, and or City Council, if it's a planned development, those would have vesting.
I'm going to kind of answer a little bit this question here from Courtney about the a story that's been in the news here in Greenville about the Sterling community and a development there, and they're asking what we will ensure to what we will do to ensure the same thing doesn't happen again in other neighborhoods. This is an issue over naming a development, and in this case, the name is being changed because neighbors spoke up. And so that's what we're going to continue to ask people do. We're going to ask neighborhoods to be vocal and to let developers know when they're not comfortable with something, let the city know when they're not comfortable with something. And that's how change is made, by making your voice heard. And we are, you know, appreciative that the folks in the Sterling community strongly spoke out, knew their rights, and voiced their concerns. And that's how you make change. And so considering all that, I guess that's kind of the best way to answer that one without diving too deep into that question. We've got about 3 minutes left. Is there anything that you, Thomas, or Christy, or Larry would like to say in wrap up, or to prepare us for the next session here next month?
You know, I would just jump in and say, kind of echo what you just said. Please encourage your friends, your relatives, your family, your colleagues, to please come out, attend the meetings, attend the open houses, pay attention to the website to see what's going on. Any input that we can get is both necessary and beneficial, right? It's your community, right? And so we want to make sure that we code it in such a way that it addresses those needs, furthers the needs of Greenville 2040, the comprehensive plan, but also addresses day-to-day needs of people on the ground. And so input is going to be important. We know it gets a little bit technical, but we assure you that we will do our best to not use acronyms. We will do our best to not use technical planning language. And if we do, please call us on it. We will correct ourselves and make sure that we explain, but we really need their participation and input. But I turn it over to Christy and Larry as well.
I would add one other point, and it came up today at the meeting with the Community Empowerment Group. And the point that came up was that maybe 2 or 3 times in a century, our zoning codes changed. We need to do the best job we can this time around so that we get the best zoning code that we can possibly get, because it may be another 30, 40, or 50 years before it's redone again. So let's do it right this time. Let's do it as well as we can, and let's face the difficult challenges and let's meet them head on and try and get the best code that we can, because we won't be able to turn around and do that again in another 2 or 3 years. We've got to get this one right for the next generation of people to come along, including, well, ourselves and the next generation that happen to come along.
And we are going to add the recording of this as we have the other ones to our website, greenvillesc.gov. People can obviously type in code connection or development code and find more information, listen to previous meetings, follow us on social media. We'll put out Facebook invites for the next online meeting and make sure that we invite folks to public meetings and these neighborhood meetings when we have them. Because as we mentioned, I think sometimes when people hear development code, they think, oh, they mean like, economic development. They mean like the big buildings. They don't mean my neighborhood. But I love how Christy talked about the idea of, okay, so we're talking about building, things in your neighborhood that maybe look like one house, but are actually a duplex or, something different. And so I think the more we talk about the possibilities and the options and what neighborhoods need to start thinking about what they would feel good about, the more this becomes very accessible to the regular person. And they think, yeah, man, I do need to pay attention to this. Excellent. Thank you all so much for being here with us again. Meeting has been recorded, will be posted to the website. We will answer the chat questions, continue to build on our FAQ. And Thomas, we'll see you and Larry and Christy again next month for another Code Connection. Thanks for being here tonight, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Thank you.